Hello, good afternoon, good morning, whichever time you're listening to this podcast. Thank you for joining us again. This is the Apprenticeship Insights podcast from both the Alex Group and Richard Moore Solutions. Thanks for joining us again. This is the second in a series of podcasts to address the challenges in apprenticeships in the apprenticeship world. And with me again, I do have returning all three members, which would be Bally, Bhogal, the Managing Director of the Alex Group, and also apprenticeship consultant, auditor, and governor of apprenticeships for both small and large private apprenticeship training providers. With Bally, I have George Kakaire, the head of quality for the Alex Group, an experienced and qualified IQA and assessor/trainer for work-based learning programs with over 20 years of experience. And finally, last but most certainly not least, I have Richard Moore of Richard Moore Solutions, an ex-Ofsted full-time inspector and manager who works with training providers and employer providers and colleges as a consultant for Ofsted quality and curriculum and government for an outstanding college group, and also on the board for a number of training providers and employer providers. So Bally, George, Richard, thank you for joining us again. How is everyone today?
Hi Vinh, it's Bally here. Lovely to be back, and lovely to be back with Richard and George. Very well, thank you, and super excited about this podcast, the second in the series, and looking forward to discussing this particular topic in detail with my colleagues.
Thank you, Bally. Richard, good to hear from you again. How are you?
Yeah, likewise, very well, thank you. I'm trying to cope with all these bank holiday weeks in May, and I'm quite interested in the fact that they have the DFE and ESFA have actually released the provisional funding rules for next year, well ahead of time. They were under a lot of pressure. They've been under a lot of pressure to start releasing provisional changes much earlier in the preceding year than they used to. And it is good to see that this year they've already released the provisional changes for 2023-24.
Interesting. I thought the bank holidays would give people a bit of a break, but evidently not for the people in this sector. George, good to have you again. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Vinh. Good afternoon, all. I'm glad to be back. It's always interesting when we get to this time of the year when snippets of, as Richard has kind of alluded to think that actually this time around, the publication is coming a lot earlier to give people a bit more time, which I suppose only time will tell to see how this really has, if at all, any positive impact on how things then begin to pan out overall.
Fingers crossed as well, I would say. Thank you all again. So what we're going to do today is dive into that with far more detail and hopefully reach a consensus on how exactly to deal with this particular issue. So, and mainly whether they actually impact the quality and compliance within apprenticeship delivery. Could be yes, could be no, but hopefully we'll find out today. Bally, straight to you. How do they really impact training provider businesses?
So great question, Vinh, thank you. Funding rules changes. Funding rules have been around for years, for as long as we've been in the sector, and funding rule changes have also come with that frequently. Sometimes they've been in year, a couple of times a year, and sometimes probably just one time in the year, but they're super important to training provider businesses. So just to give a few examples of the kinds of changes that have taken place, that we've seen take place, I mean, in my experience, they've gone from 40-50 page documents to 140-50 page documents. They've become very, very lengthy, quite heavy. God forbid if you ever printed them out. I don't know anybody who does that anymore, but back in the day when I used to work in the sector, we used to print them out, we used to go through them in detail, and we used to really kind of adhere to them and make sure that everything we did really kind of was focused around compliance, obviously, as well as the quality. So some examples really of the more recent funding rule changes we've seen. So we've seen the ESFA really outline their requirements for initial assessments. They've been a lot more prescriptive around this, so they expect a skills scan to take place that really enables applicants to be, assessed against knowledge, skills and behaviours against the standard apprenticeship specification. They've been a lot more prescriptive in terms of how that skills scan, once completed, has to evidence that there's new knowledge, skills and behaviours that have been uncovered and are, have to be delivered against in terms of the training. And that obviously that kind of initial assessment then helps to condense the programme, the duration, the price, for example. So all of these nuances are in this one little area of initial assessment, and then how that impacts the training provider, really from kind of just looking back and zooming out. It's those changes in documents, changes in pro formas, changes in the material content of that initial assessment, changes to systems, processes, procedures, just to support this change in the actual funding rule. There's a lot of information that goes into it, a lot of kind of analysis, really going back to your processes and kind of sometimes starting all over, quite frankly. And then this particular funding rule has implications for recruitment teams and how initial assessments are conducted, either by the apprenticeship team or by a separate recruitment team, as we often see in employer providers. So there's one example. A second example is, this was a big one, fairly recent change in last year's funding rules, just a change of the wording, commitment statement to training plan. So again, the training providers, in kind of my experience, some of our clients were running around just changing terminology within their documents, within their pro formas. Everybody's then, now referring to what was the commitment statement as training plan. So again, there's that implications of new terminology and how that impacts practitioners within the sector. Also, what good looks like. So not only have you changed the terminology, you're now calling it a training plan. There's also new rules in place in terms of what that training plan should contain. For example, the fields, the data, and there's a new ruling that's coming around the funds will be at risk to providers if they don't show, when asked, an up-to-date training plan. So clearly that has implications for providers. I mean, I'm going to point out here, I've got colleagues here that can really comment on this, so I'll probably leave this bit to them. But what good looks like in a training plan, does that get discussed early? Does that standardization process, what does that look like, for example? And there's also an implication for employers here in the training plan in terms of becoming involved in it, not just the training providers. And then progress reviews. I know we're going to do a podcast just on progress reviews at some point or discuss this one in detail, but just the fact that they have to be carried out now every 12 weeks. So that's mandated, and it's a three-way discussion. That's become very, very black and white now in the funding rules, never used to be. And sort of, what implications this has for training providers. For example, I was talking to an employer yesterday and they did not know that progress reviews, their attendance at those progress reviews were mandatory. To be fair, this was the coordinator at a very high level within an organisation who didn't know that, but thankfully line managers were conducting the progress reviews as required. So just again, communications, there's a bigger implication in terms of changes in funding rules and communication across training providers, employers, line managers and apprentices. And then another example, final one I'll bring up before I pass over to my colleagues, the real big hitter that's been coming our way here, new for 22-23, the subcontracting standards, so lead providers adhering to this super duper framework that the ESFA have developed. It's a new 3-year cycle. It has a lot of focus now on procurement, pre-award activities, etc. People, skills, relationship management, performance management, risk management. payments, incentives, provider CPD. So actual development and training for providers, your supply chains. So that's a real big new one. Oh, that's a real big one and a new one for big lead providers, and also the smaller supply chain colleges or universities, etc., that are part of their subcontracted chain. So yeah, here's some examples. So yeah, I'll pass back over to you, Vinh.
Bally, thank you so much for the examples, and it really helped to contextualize all that information. One of the first things I thought of after your explanation was that there's so much information and all these training providers being inundated with all of this. Do you think it's reasonable for so much information to be handed over to them for them to adhere to? Is it feasible for them to follow all of these rules and regulations, or do you think these funding rules need to be toned down somewhat or simplified at the very least?
Yeah, I think operationally, I think, Vin, the question you've asked is a great question, because increasingly my view on this overall picture is I'm always kind of concerned about when the new rules come in or amended rules are implemented. The question I always ask is, to what extent is it being informed by the stakeholders, i.e. namely the learner, the employer, and training providers? And consequently, I think it becomes that odd continuous argument, or if you like, disruption, that, the three parties probably feel. Because my view is whenever there are changes, inevitably these will impact the training provider to start off with. Now, the manner in which information is cascaded to training providers has always been problematic in my view, because the people on the sharp end, i.e. delivery staff, usually are not the ones who are actually receiving this information, because the briefing might be undertaken by ESFA, someone senior within an organization as a high up within the apprenticeship sort of provision attends this seminar, workshop, webinar, whatever it is. They listen to whatever they've got to listen, but ultimately they don't have to implement what those implications are. So operationally, I always sort of think that the frequency with which funding rules are updated or even amended is not really helpful operationally for those people who are on the receiving end. I consequently then sort of think that then will have a long-term impact in terms of the starts. Because if you think about a typical start from start to finish, if you wanted to recruit a new apprentice to a training program, before you even think about the actual delivery, there's almost a time lag of 12 weeks. So straight away, what that says to me is that there needs to be probably a bit of a bigger thinking around stakeholder engagement in terms of how the ESFA roll these rules out, because I'm not even confident that the learners have in any shape or form make any contribution to what ultimately is something that eventually impacts on them. But I'm not too sure whether I have been able to kind of articulate or indeed respond to the scenario that you just put to us, Vin.
No, it's a problem, but your thoughts are always valued, George. Thank you. Richard, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I tend to come at things from a slightly different perspective, as George and certainly Bally will know, in that I'm not spending a lot of time with the providers I work with looking at compliance or necessarily at adherence to funding rule changes, particularly around the financial implications of these changes. I'm sort of very focused, and I know Bally and George are as well to some extent, on the quality side of things. And what I if I'm being really honest, what I see at the sharp end of delivery and quality this year hasn't much changed from previous years. I still see learners essentially getting 1 day a week across their program for their off-the-job training. I essentially do see people in the right job role that matches an apprenticeship. Not always, but essentially I see that. I see skill scans being used, initial assessment processes. The issue is, I think, much more when they take place rather than whether they take place. And yeah, there were some issues around things like the employer should receive the outcomes of that initial assessment and doesn't always do so. And when it comes to things like progress reviews and the requirement to have them at a minimum of every 12 weeks, well, the vast majority of providers were carrying out progress reviews with their learners every 8 to 12 weeks anyway. I only very rarely came across providers that were doing them, say, every 16 weeks. And I used to say to those providers, that's far too, long to leave a learner for 4 months without a one-to-one formal review of their progress. And yes, it's fine to say that it's mandatory that the employer must attend, but that doesn't in a way resolve or change what I've seen in the landscape, which is still a very mixed picture of whether employers do turn up for reviews or not. Some providers are very good at always getting all of the employers to turn up for the tripartite review. Other providers are poor at that. What is most typical is that certain employers with a training provider are very good in terms of attending reviews. Other employers aren't. But I don't know whether that has drastically changed because of the changes in the funding rules, or whether it's more about providers becoming more savvy with standards as time has gone on, coming out of COVID into a more settled position and being more understanding of what Ofsted expect to see. I don't know whether it's the funding rule changes that have really kind of driven that or not.
Richard, for me, I get the sense that there's some kind of detachment between the ESFA and then there's the enforcement, which obviously comes from Ofsted. It seems to me that it's almost a form of delegation, that the ESFA set out the set of rules, and then by default, inspectors would then somehow prod and check on the effectiveness of how providers are effecting this. Is that kind of my way of thinking, or am I not on the right way of?
Well, I think that's very contentious, really, George. I would say that if you sat down a cross section of Ofsted, HMI, and indeed part-time inspectors and said to them, can you tell me the 10 changes to the funding rules for 2022-23 that you think will have most impacted on what you as an Ofsted inspector need to look at on inspection, and you ask them what they thought those changes were, I think you'd see some very mixed practice, and you'd see everything from an inspector who perhaps worked in the sector part-time, who had a very good knowledge of some of the changes and requirements, and I think you'd see some other inspectors who perhaps may or may not be full-time, who had never got round to reading the very lengthy document that Bally's already alluded to, and I've got it here in front of me, all 100 and something pages of it. And if you were to say to them, what are the changes around progress reviews, around initial assessment, around, I think they'd know about the off the job, the 6 hours versus the 20%. I think perhaps most of them would know about that, but I think you'd find that their knowledge of those changes would be very mixed.
So, I mean, listening to what you're saying there, really inherent from that kind of thinking or that way of analysis, what that tells me is there are a lot of negative unintended consequences that really I'm not too sure how the ESFA kind of getting to grips with as and when they're implementing, and to what extent that the stakeholders are actually ready to receive the new regime and its plan for its intended consequences. Because, for example, I was looking at the rule around training plan, where it sort of says the training plan has to be completed well before the training starts. Now, knowing as I do that when employers are going to recruit members of staff as apprentices, there's always an issue of a start date. So if you're sort of going to say, for example, that you need to get the training plan completed before the learner actually starts in learning, straight away I'm going to be thinking as an employer, okay, so who is going to be paying for this learner before they actually start learning? If I'm expected to be undertaking activities around their learning well before they start, because there are implications in terms of employment law around that particular issue.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. I mean, individual learning plans are an interesting one. It's quite a good example of what I've just been talking about, because there is now a requirement for every learner to have an individual learning plan, for it to be in place before they start their training. It should itemize all of the off-the-job training that they're going to do, which of course is fine for the scripted off-the-job training that the learner's going to get in the workshops and the webinars, because the provider has probably planned that out through the sort of curriculum they're going to deliver. But there's no way that in advance at the start of the program the learner and the employer can identify, for example, all of the work-based off-the-job training they're going to do. So that has to be added into the plan as the learner goes along, and possibly as that's agreed during a progress review. Excuse me. And yet I see very few providers who are actually doing that and have what I would call a proper individual learning plan in place. And I don't know how many inspectors are looking at that either, because I'm not entirely sure how many inspectors know that that is a requirement now for the learners to have that plan, and for it to clearly identify all the off-the-job training, and for it to be contemporaneous, so that it is showing at any moment in time exactly what the learner has done and what they've still got to do, because off-the-job training activities have to be planned within the ILP to count as off-the-job training. As that was one of the stipulations in the original funding rules, and I sort of feel that's got a bit lost. And I think the ESFA are carrying out some checks on that with providers from the feedback I get, but the ESFA is not really my world, so I don't get too much into that. But I have heard recently from providers of mine that the ESFA are carrying out those checks on training providers in relation to individual learning plans. I had a provider of mine say that they'd had an audit just a couple of weeks ago as part of a sample of 10 providers, and ILPs had been looked at, and there was an expectation that the off-the-job training was clearly set out in that ILP.
See, Richard, thank you so much. We've discussed briefly about how it impacts training provider businesses, but I'm wondering how it impacts, we have touched upon how it impacts operations and the delivery of training as well. Also, but I'd like to discuss that a bit further, please. George, could you elaborate? That's all.
It kind of concerns me that, that we talk about the funding rules, and I have no way of understanding the thinking behind why ESFA sort of make the amendments, or indeed attach some kind of new regime as a revision, because I'm not sure where they get their answers from in terms of impact. Because increasingly, when you're operationally sort of dealing with some of these things, for example, we touched on recruitment, we've touched on things like reviews, we've touched on things like training plans. A lot of this is administratively heavy. And my view is a lot of this stuff is being pushed to the point, for example, initial assessments and training plans. If you look at the current regime of how the rules stand, there would be an assumption that the training provider is having to undertake a hell of a lot of activities, i.e. initial assessments, training plans, for activities that they're actually not being paid for. And I wonder whether there is a thinking within the ESF that training providers will have to obviously absorb these extra costs, because in any case, say for example, learner A is a potential learner. You do initial assessments, the individual training plans, and that learner, for whatever reason, doesn't start. That is a hell of a lot of investment on a training provider, which effectively the ESFA are not really going to want to know or even cater for in terms of provision.
I just want to add to that in terms of, if I may come in, it's interesting that, you know, we're talking about where do the sort of changes derive from, where do the ESFA get their data from? Well, clearly the ESFA have got auditors, you know, that go out and do those kinds of ILR audits, provider financial monitoring audits, and actually when they do those and they get you know, a large batch of those done or a small batch, they analyze that data in a lot of detail, and that's where they get a lot of information from in terms of, okay, how do our rules play out? What feedback are we getting? You know, are they conducive? There was a big consultation that the ESFA did. So I think it was last year, maybe 18 months ago, 12 months ago, 18 months ago, to really sort of understand, you know, how do we simplify the funding rules. There was a conference that took place in Birmingham back in December as well, and it was actually entitled you know, simplifying the funding rules or simplifying the system, from what I recall. And there was a big emphasis and focus on, you know, what can we do to make this easier for you? And I think there was an acceptance as well from the ESFA's end that, you know, we understand and we can see that the rules have become lengthy documents, quite possibly too prescriptive, too long, and that sort of was the face-to-face sort of consultation that they did, which I think helped, and it was very well attended by the sector, by lots of different types of training providers. There was a number of different sort of workshops, and they were there was, you know, dialogue, let's put it that way, you know, good quality two-way dialogue, and the way they sort of concluded that day was very much, you know, what we will do is go away, take away all this feedback. We want you to continue to give feedback to us. And, you know, we're making ourselves accessible to you. So that's never been done before. So that was quite a new approach from what I saw and what I gathered back in December. And I feel that that has sort of shown, the impact of that has shown in this one set. What we now have going forward is a set of provider funding rules that is applicable to all types of providers, if you like. However, I think going back to George's point around learners, you don't really see much learner input, possibly even employer input to the funding rules. It is very much centered around training providers. So I know that that was you know, quite a large activity that took place around that consultation, you know, not around about 6 months ago, really, to create this set of funding rules.
Fantastic, Bally. Thank you. Richard, what are your thoughts on what Bally has just said?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about how realistic it would be. I'm not shooting the messenger here because it's not Bally saying it should happen, but just about how you would realistically get learners involved in any consultation on funding rules. You know, putting it simply, a learner just wants to receive a good quality education and training that develops knowledge, skills and behaviours that they didn't have before. They want to enjoy it, find it a bit of fun, get their work marked promptly, get some good feedback, and kind of pass their qualification at the end of it, whilst making sure that they feel safe, you know, throughout their apprenticeship. So I'm not sure how realistically one could bring learners into the equation. It's difficult enough to get learners to understand what the endpoint assessment methodologies are and whether they can get a merit or distinction. Same with employers. I mean, I don't know how much employers would want to be involved, and I mean genuinely mean I don't know, rather than in the sense of I don't know. I don't think they would. I really I'm not sure, and I think you probably find there'd be employers who'd very much like to be involved in that. And I think, you know, they did have a voice in the move from the 20% to the 6 hours based on you know, the number of full-time hours that learners work. I suppose it's what elements of the changes you'd want to consult with employers on. But I just want to go back to another point that Bally made earlier about, and it was a very good point about, you know, there are often reasons behind these changes. It's easy to knock the ESFA and say, oh well, you know, they keep changing things every year, the rules get more and more complex. If we just go back to the change around the training plan, and the training plan having to identify the number of off-the-job hours that the learner was going to do up front and what activities they were going to carry out. And again, I'm not really very sure how well providers have implemented that, but one of the big sort of one of the reasons that kind of led to that, and I used to see it quite a lot, was providers who would get to the end of a learner's training program, the learner would be 30 or 40 hours down on their off-the-job training, and I saw this actually happen in reviews where the trainer would say to the learner, oh, just add in 40 hours of mentoring into your off-the-job training log. That was the kind of worst case scenario. What was almost as bad, but not quite so bad, was the trainer saying to the learner, well, go back into the workplace and just see if you can arrange 10 hours of shadowing sometime before the end of your training. So a very sort of superficial, engineered, you know, just arrange something so that we can count it as off the job training, even if actually the learner wasn't going to develop any new knowledge, skills and behaviours from that shadowing. So I think in defence of some of the changes the SFA have made, they are based on things that providers have done wrong, and I think the SFA sometimes doesn't want to say that, and providers are very quick to criticise and are not always angels themselves. You know, it's like providers are very quick to criticise Ofsted, but they don't mind putting the Ofsted banner up outside the college or the school when they get good or outstanding. So I think sometimes, you know, there's two sides to the story, as it were.
Thank you, Richard. What I was going to say is that there is always a level of controversy involved where people don't wish to. It makes sense where people don't wish to sound out loud the areas in which they need to improve on. And of course, yeah, we all see it all the time, Ofsted banners across every school or college, which have been rated highly. And you did mention that, you know, some changes are for the better. But I would like to hear some examples of in which case some changes have not been for the better. Can you think of any at the top of your head at all?
For me, one of the examples I would probably sort of suggest would be sort of in that arena around the off-the-job.
I see. And Bally, what are your thoughts on how the changes impact quality of training?
It's more about sort of standardization of practice sometimes when I look at from the ESFA's perspective, in terms of, you know, when I look at it from the ESFA's perspective, they're taking a very different view on how the funding rules are used within the sector. And then you've also got Ofsted in terms of the EIF and how they use the whole framework to look at quality, to review quality, and to be able to grade a provider. I think the rules overall, I genuinely think that they are intended to be useful overall, but I do believe and how, you know, how useful, I mean, you know, useful from a perspective of they outline, you know, the expectations, kind of contractual sort of obligations, you can even put it that way, that they outline very clearly, you know, what the responsibilities are of training providers. I mean, I think they can get a bit too prescriptive for, you know, I mean, they outline responsibilities around sort of performance, finance, audit, all of that kind of stuff. The real, you know, is there real benefit to learners? So going back to Richard's point around, you know, I mean, what would be the point of learners actually contributing to funding rules? Probably very little, because what Richard said was absolutely spot on. What they're looking for is a great learning experience, a great career, and equally employers the same. But what I'm seeing is that employers are being pulled into the funding rules. Their kind of responsibilities are becoming enlarged, and we're seeing a lot more from my kind of this next iteration, certainly for 23-24. There's a lot more onus on employers. So there are benefits of the funding rules and how they impact both providers and learners, ultimately the beneficiaries, if you like, of the funding. But it's very wordy, it's very prescriptive, it's very black and white, it's very laid out. I think sometimes it can stifle creativity. So from a benefits, if I had to outline from a benefits perspective, then, you know, yes, it helps to kind of create some consistency from the ESFA's perspective. You know, there's evidence tracks that are created. It's good for audit purposes. Also from a kind of data collation, just creating skills policy and looking at policy and how you might want to change that going forward for the next 5 to 10 years. So all that data that you get as well, possibly from an audit perspective, protecting the public purse, all of that. But the real impact to learners, bit questionable. Employers, again, slightly questionable, but I can see they're being bought into it more and more. The real impact is on the training providers, where they're having to really chop and change a lot of their processes, a lot of their operations, and a lot of their kind of pro formas and tools and toolkits, really, to kind of fit in with what the ESFA's requirements are, generally, is what I see. Sorry if that's a very long-winded answer to a short question.
Yeah, I just think I come back to this point of, you know, I've worked with providers all of this year since last September. Have I seen massive changes at my end of things? Yes, there may be around funding claims and around RPL and the money side of it, which I don't tend to look at. But have I seen massive changes at the coalface in terms of the regularity of progress reviews, the amount of off-the-job training, time that learners get? What happens if learners have to do any of the off-the-job coursework or whatever in their own time around initial assessment? Have I seen any massive changes in that because of the changes in the funding rules? No, I haven't. What I tend to see is good and outstanding providers who do all of those things really well, and poorer providers who don't. But that's down to the provider themselves rather than the changes in the funding rules. And I go back to the fact that I think providers are just generally year on year getting better at delivering standards, because, you know, they were still relatively new and we were coming out of COVID, which upset the apple cart. So some of the improvements are just greater familiarity rather than being down to changes in the rules, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, Richard. Thank you so much. We've kind of outlined a lot of issues that the constant changing in funding rules can bring, the benefits and hindrances it can bring. So I think most importantly at this point, what are the solutions? How do these providers cope with all these changes in the funding rules? George, I'd like to have your answer for this one, please.
Now, Vinh, if I had the answers to those questions, I would be a very rich man. Because I mean, for me, because obviously as a practitioner, I genuinely accept that there's obviously a need for a standardized approach, hence the rules. And of course, as Bally and Richard have kind of touched on the issue of obviously the public purse being safeguarded. But I happen to sort of think that most of the time, the level at which rules are being sort of cascaded out does not really address the issues that concern the stakeholders themselves. For example, if you look at the cost implications attached to whenever these rules change in terms of staffing and the costs associated with the activities therein, I don't get the feeling that the ESFA really, from a business perspective, actually get it. And consequently, I just get the feeling that they probably always take the view of kind of take it or leave it. And I don't think that is necessarily useful to the sector.
George, thank you. Bally, what are your thoughts? How would one be able to cope with the constantly changing funding rules?
It's a real tough one, and I do agree with George in as much as, you know, you have to really be prepared for the changes. You have to really anticipate them. So I think, you know, one thing's for sure is just the way you anticipate an Ofsted inspection, that it is going to come. It's just a matter of when. Always be prepared for changes in the funding rules. I think if I can differentiate also for new providers who probably have, you know, they're just new to the sector, probably never really operated in the industry before, learning their way, then obviously for them to read the funding rules and refresh themselves regularly. And on refresh yourselves every 3 months. We had, where I used to work at very large private training provider some 6-7 probably years ago, we had a colleague who used to have a very small team, 2 or 3 people with her, you know, looking at the funding rules every 3 months, and then come in and doing a spotlight session with us, the leadership and governance team, to sort of say, look, these have been the changes now, if there have been. But we had it as part of our governance meetings as well, the changes in the funding rules. So that used to work really well. The fact that there was the alert there to governors that there's been a change in requirements around compliance, you know, every 3 to 6 months you want to know, and whether or not that was an immediate, or whether that was a change required, or whether that was coming down the tracks. So all of a sudden we could start to look at that and prepare for that. We used to also test and trial what kind of worked and what didn't work to actually meet that rule requirement. So if there was a change in, for example, let's say a pro forma needs to be changed because they now need, there's more requirements around the data actually required, or the information. So a perfect example would be a training plan. It might have started off, let's say, for example, very thin on the ground, few fields, but now 6-7 years later, you know, there's pages and pages of it, for example. But, you know, test and trial your pro formas whenever the changes take place, and then chop and change. So just be adaptable with that. And I think the big one that everybody always forgets how to cope with changes in funding rules is train your staff regularly on them, so that they help you to be compliant with the funding rules. Richard will probably also agree with me. We've certainly seen it with our clients. I don't know if Richard's also seen it with his, is that every time an Ofsted inspection takes place, it's followed up fairly quickly, we're seeing, by an ESFA audit. And from that perspective, you know, compliance and quality become very, very important, even though they are two sides to a coin and very different in nature. So train your staff regularly on the funding rules. I say as and when they take place, maybe not that frequently, but certainly keep an eye on them. And if you're new providers, you'll probably read it and you'll probably think, I have no idea what this is talking about. But funding rules are funding rules. You learn them on the job. You learn to apply them on the job, but take advice from somebody that's already been there, perhaps, you know, get some training from within the sector, for example, speak to other training providers to really try to understand and get a take on funding rules and their importance too. your data, your payments, your evidence, and just protecting that whole public purse, the interest there. So I hope that helps, just as a few ideas from my end.
Bally, it really does help. Thank you. And speaking of whom, Richard, any top tips at all to cope with the changes in the funding rules?
So my first obvious tip would be to get somebody like Bally and her company and colleagues in to take you through the funding rules and to do whatever audit and compliance work is necessary. I think do go to the sort of events that will be running in the next few months prior to the start of the new contract year, that a lot of the sort of training companies put on nationally. I think what's important there is that your MIS compliant sort of data managers, they need to have that very intimate understanding around costs and coding and all that sort of thing. But I think what you need to tease out of the changes are very clearly, one side of paper perhaps, what are the things that the training staff at the coal face need to make sure happens. And I know that when I went to a lot of training events around the funding changes at last summer, a lot of it was very confusing. It wasn't particularly relevant to me because I'm not filling in forms and making claims and doing costs. So I don't need to have that exact sort of knowledge. But what I came away and did, and really what training staff need to have, is what are the things you need to look for at the coal face. Active learning every 4 weeks, which is now going to be changing again. Progress review at least every 12 weeks, an individual learning plan, 6 hours off the job training per week if you work 30 hours or more. So I came away and distilled out of it, for me, the very practical changes that the learner's going to see, if you like, and that the training staff are going to have to make sure they implement. So it's about familiarity for different types of people within the provider, and what does the MIS compliance data manager need to know, and what does the trainer or assessor need to make sure happens. And it went to start off with, the documentation is so overwhelming that you sometimes can't separate those two things out very easily.
Fantastic, Richard. Thank you. Let's summarize what we've gone through. The different impacts of the different aspects of apprenticeships. We've gone through the benefits and hindrances. We've come up with some solutions, but what's going to happen next, does everyone think? Bally, you first. What kind of changes do you think they will implement next?
Apart from what's already coming down the line and what I can see in the next set of funding rules, obviously it's great to see one document. I'd love to see that document. I probably can't take a punt on this one. I'd like to see that halved, so I'm not going to say that. But what I can see, there's a move towards more employer involvement, and more the rules are kind of explicitly stating that there's responsibilities on the employer, so they're drawing or dragging the employers into it. I don't know, I can't say whether or not employers are kind of okay with that, or they're happy for to take on additional responsibilities, and for this to be mandated via funding rules. So if I had to hazard a guess, I don't know, it's probably be something crazy like employers will probably be able to do potentially multiple progress reviews with, say, a number of apprentices that they may have in either less time or at the same time, where they might be on a similar apprenticeship. And I think that there's a bit of an issue brewing around this in terms of how do you undertake multiple or lots of progress reviews, especially where learners start on the same cohort at the same time, and they all belong to one or work under one department and line manager. So I think that's brewing. We're certainly seeing a sense of that now. So I think that's kind of my best guess at the minute.
George, what about you? What do you predict will be changing next?
I think for me, from a practical point of view, I can see that it is useful for, say, organizations such as say, for example, colleges, where they tend to have static times when they start cohorts of learners. It will help them probably, if they're well prepared, if they sort of take advantage of the early release of those rules to really carry out a sense of CPD before the summer. I can see that has great value. However, for small independent providers who've got a roll-on kind of sort of regime, I can see how that becomes very problematic in terms of their implementation, because if you're looking at, because they do a roll-on all the year round, there is almost no point at which they can almost take a stance and sort of say, we stop, and then to start implementing these new measures without necessarily having kickback from staff and probably even employers, because it's a case of like, yes, 14 weeks ago, you said blah, blah, blah. And then at this point in time, you seem to be changing your tune in relation to some of the things that you've said. So I can see where there are going to be some real benefits for providers who always have that regime of, they start learners at a specific point of time. But I can also see that it's going to create a lot of problems for small independent training providers in how they really standardize and actually implement the new changes that may, although they're not significantly different, all the same, it always has an impact in terms of, for example, when you have to do, do you have to rejig some of your templates in terms of training plans, initial assessments, and so on and so forth. So looking forward, that is kind of how I see the kind of template rolling out going forward. Richard, did you want to say something?
Yes, I just got to add a couple of things. I'm not so sure whether these are around funding rule changes, but I think what's coming down the line certainly is going to be this continued focus on the number of employers who are putting their staff in for higher level apprenticeships from level 4 and upwards, and to what extent that is really a genuine apprenticeship at times, rather than using the levy to just put managers through CPD that the employer then doesn't have to pay for in any other way. And I don't know about both of you, but for every one apprentice I see on what I call a traditional level 2 apprenticeship in catering, hairdressing, construction, those sorts of trades that you used to see all the time. So for every one of those apprentices I see, I probably now see 30 apprentices on team leading, senior leader, project manager, operations manager, and so on. And I wonder what was going to happen there. That perhaps isn't necessarily to do with funding, but I wonder if there may be some leverage there that will redress that balance. And the other thing I think that's going to be coming down the line is going to be this whole business of qualifications within a standard and the retention problems that have been caused by learners getting the qualification, the industry recognized professional qualification, the badge, if you like, within the standard, and then dropping off their apprenticeship standard because they don't actually need the standard. The standard isn't particularly recognized in that industry. They don't need their functional skills, and we have still got a massive retention problem. The last 2 years, the overall national retention figure has more or less been exactly the same as the achievement figure. So where we had a 51.4% achievement rate last year, the retention rate was almost exactly the same. The pass rate was almost 100%. So those learners who do get to the end, they pass, but half of them are dropping out along the way. And that is an issue that is being looked at, and it'll be interesting to see what, if any, and I really can't get my head around it at the moment, what, if any, changes there might be to the funding rules that will reflect the fact that getting part of the qualification will be wrapped up in the endpoint assessment, so that learners will have to stay on programme right to the end before they can gain the qualification as well as the standard.
Richard, thank you so much for your response too. Let's finish up there. So in summary, we have delved deeper into the ever-changing funding rules and hopefully answered the question of whether they impact quality and compliance within apprenticeship delivery or not. And we've come up with some solutions. Hopefully we can all take away from that too. In the following podcast, we'll be diving into more of the topics which we outlined initially. We hope to hear from you all again soon. So in light of that, I want to thank again Bally, George and Richard for coming together and discussing this further. And we'll all meet up at the next podcast. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vinh.
Thank you.